Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and welcome again to our talk this week, which is on religiosity and recognition, multiculturalism and British converts to Islam. And this is based on a book by Dr. Thomas Seeley, who will be joining us and delivering the main talk. We'll begin the program with the recitation of the Holy Quran. So we'll start with that now.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لم تقولون ما لا تفعلون كبر مقتا عند الله أن تقولوا ما لا تفعلون إن الله يحب الذين يقاتلون في سبيله صفا كأنهم بنيان مرصوص. وإذ قال موسى لقومه يا قوم لم تؤذونني وقد تعلمون أني رسول الله إليكم فلما زاغوا أزاغ الله قلوبهم والله لا يهدي القوم الفاسقين. وإذ قال عيسى ابن مريم يا بني إسرائيل إني رسول الله إليكم مصدقا لما بين يدي من التوراة ومبشرا برسول يأتي من بعده اسمه أحمد. فلما جاءهم بالبينات قالوا هذا سحر مبين. ومن أظلم ممن افترى على الله الكذب وهو يدعى إلى الإسلام والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. يريدون ليطفئوا نور الله بأفواههم والله متم نوره ولو كره الكافرون. هو الذي أرسل رسوله بالهدى ودين الحق ليظهره على الدين كله ولو كره المشركون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا هل أدلكم على تجارة تنجيكم من عذاب أليم. تؤمنون بالله ورسوله وتجاهدون في سبيل الله بأموالكم وأنفسكم ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. يغفر لكم ذنوبكم ويدخلكم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار ومساكن طيبة في جنات عدن ذلك الفوز العظيم. وأخرى تحبونها نصر من الله وفتح قريب وبشر المؤمنين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا أنصار الله كما قال عيسى ابن مريم للحواريين من أنصاري إلى الله قال الحواريون نحن أنصار الله. فآمنت طائفة من بني إسرائيل وكفرت طائفة فأيدنا الذين آمنوا على عدوهم فأصبحوا ظاهرين. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that beautiful recitation. Brothers and sisters, today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Thomas Seeley, who will be speaking about his recently published book entitled Religiosity and Recognition, Multiculturalism and British Converts to Islam. I've been speaking to him just before this talk, and I'm very excited to hear him. So without further ado, we will introduce him. Dr. Thomas Seeley is a research associate working on Greece, which is a Horizon 2020 funded project which compares the governance of religious diversity and radicalization across 23 countries, and also Pluralistic, which is a HERA funded project looking at governance and of ethnic diversity in European public spaces. He's based in the Center of Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship in the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol in UK. And he's published on multiculturalism, Islamophobia, the governance of Muslims in the UK, the governance of religious diversity, and converts to Islam in Britain. His new monograph with Palgrave explores multiculturalism and converts to Islam in Britain, and looks at issues of religious identity and belonging. His research interests include multiculturalism, the relationship between religion, ethnicity, and race, and religion and secularism. So without further ado, Dr. Thomas Seeley.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. And let me just share the screen. What's happening now? Entire screen. Okay, hopefully you can see slides now. Thank you very much for being here, and in his absence, thank you to Mikdad for inviting me. So as Kemal has just said, this evening I'm going to be talking about my new book, which has just come out, and which looks at issues around multiculturalism and converts to Islam in Britain, particularly focusing on issues of identity and belonging. That will be what I kind of talk most about. And I should probably also just say, having said it's about converts to Islam in Britain, I will, for simple matter of ease, use converts most of the time rather than other words or phrases such as reverts or new Muslims or so on and so forth. But you know, this is more complicated than that, obviously, and something I'd be happy to talk about in the Q&A. So I want to begin by saying something briefly about the stance of the book and the kind of the bigger picture that it fits into. So the book begins from and rests on the premise that there's a greater need for a more nuanced and positive thinking and discussions about religion in society, and that this is so for reasons that are both positive as well as negative. So to begin with the negative side of this, in a general sense, we can see what Grace Davey, who's a prominent sociologist of religion, has referred to this as a paradox, and that is that at the same time that religious belief and belonging is becoming an increasingly minority position, and along with it a general kind of religious literacy has declined, at this time issues of public religion and debates and controversies around religion have become much more prominent and important in political and public debates. But this means, as Davey says, that taking faith seriously is becoming increasingly the exception rather than the norm. And this creates a set of problems as debates in this area become more important. And in this context, also general attitudes to religion, or at least religion in a kind of public sense, are largely negative. The British Social Attitude Survey from 2019, for example, found that over a third of people think that religious organisations have too much power, and almost 2/3 say that they agree that religion brings more conflict than peace. Prominent think tanks have found that in policy documents, religion tends to be seen as a problem to be solved rather than as some kind of a positive part of the solution of various social problems itself. Social hostilities involving religion have been increasing in recent years. And a recent study actually refers to religion as the final frontier, as it puts it, when it comes to discrimination, noting that while some other forms of prejudice might be declining, this is not the case with religious discrimination. And of course, these kinds of issues, as well as others, are particularly acute when it comes to Muslims and Islam, who are, as I'm sure you're all aware, regularly linked with terrorism, radicalization, and seen as out of step with modern liberal values and this kind of thing. So if that's kind of something of the negative side of the picture, on the positive side, and this can be stated reasonably briefly, is that religious identity is understood as something that is qualitatively different from other identity categories, and so is something that needs to be taken kind of much more seriously, and we need to have better conversations about. Studies, for example, such as the one in the book by Danda Hannes, pictured here, have found that it is often considered a primary, it's above other categories and in relation to other categories. And it's also not seen as in conflict or contradiction with them, as is often kind of supposed or set up to be. So if this is kind of something of that broader picture, how do converts more specifically fit into it? Well, what we find is that, particularly in media coverage, it's largely negative, and that the image of the convert arises as one associated often with radicalization and terrorism. And what we kind of find in general is that both the conversion and the convert's intentions and motivations are questioned in these kinds of discourses in a few different ways. They might be seen as not genuine religious conversions, i.e. they're seen as a conversion of convenience for the purpose of getting married or something like this. They might be seen as dangerous precisely because they are religious, and, of course, to a religion that's perceived often as inclined to violence and oppression. Or they might be seen as some kind of anomaly, a result of falling in love or of personal instability. The whole idea of some kind of a crisis, a personal crisis, is prominent. And another way in which they appear in kind of this kind of coverage is as the result of processes of brainwashing, particularly at the hands of radical imams and this kind of thing. So this is how the media often portrays them. In general, in other ways, in kind of wider parts of society and including in the academic literature, they're often seen through cultural or ethnic kind of frames. So converts are seen as becoming culturally or ethnically other. And the religious aspect is simply kind of lost here. And as I said, the academic literature tends to see them primarily in terms of ethnicity or race. And again, the religious aspect is kind of pushed to the side a little bit. And I'm going to say a little bit more about these as we go on. But before I get to talking about the findings from my study, more specifically, I think it's interesting as well as useful to say something about how the contemporary context is both kind of similar to, it reflects aspects of the historical context, but also a couple of ways in which it contrasts. And these are also important for, particularly important for the situation that converts find themselves in. So one way, if we think about, for example, identity, something that's kind of found in the historical picture in books such as these pictured, and that we find echoed in the contemporary context, is the aspect of connecting deeply with God in Islam and with Islam's kind of theological framework, if you like. So Abdullah Quilliam, who some of you, kind of a name some of you I'm sure are familiar with, talks about how Quilliam was attracted by the rationality of Islam, which he also felt met the intellectual challenges of the period, but kept him in touch with the monotheistic deity. And Lord Henry Stanley, in a letter to his brother, remarked that he said, I have always been a Muslim at heart, to use as he put it in the kind of parlance of the day. And Lady Evelyn Cobbold, another prominent and kind of very well-known convert of the time, also remarked that it seems that I have always been a Muslim. And as we're going to see, we see these kind of ideas kind of reflected by contemporary converts as well. A further parallel is that to greater or lesser extents, present-day converts might, as their historical kind of forebears, if that's not too weird a way of saying it, might also look for pragmatic solutions in order to reconcile their faith with the social context of Britain. Patterns of discrimination are also in some way similar, or at least have a kind of contemporary parallel. And negotiating this kind of an Islamic identity in Britain is challenging now, as it also was then. The kind of trope of betrayal, which was levied at converts during the Victorian period, is something that converts also have thrown at them today, as well as certain other kind of forms of abuse in the street and this kind of thing. But just as important, particularly for some aspects of the kind of story I'm going to be telling, are the differences. So during the Victorian period, converts were much more prominent. Like in terms of thinking about British Islam, if we think about what that was in that time, converts are a very prominent part of this picture. But in the latter half of the 20th century, converts became increasingly marginal as part of what we might think of in kind of a very broad sense as kind of this idea of British Islam or Islam or Muslims in Britain. And this kind of shift, this change in position, is a kind of a result of a few different factors. One is that the emerging Muslim populations from migration patterns following the Second World War and coming from kind of former colonial territories came with their own cultural, social and political interests as well as struggles. Prominent converts such as Abdullah Quilliam died, and they weren't kind of replaced in the kind of prominent leadership sense specifically related to kind of converts. And another is that as Islam and Muslims began to establish communities in Britain in the kind of second half of the 20th century, this was done in large part along ethnic and sectarian lines. And this complicates the picture into which converts kind of are emerging and trying to find a place. As a kind of very quick statistic, this is a few years old now, but I'm sure it hasn't changed. I don't think it's changed too much, if at all. And that is that a mere 0.3% of mosques have committees or trustees with a convert who's kind of involved with the running of it. Not for not ununderstandable reasons, but this is quite a different shift in the kind of structural context into which converts are emerging and trying to find their place. So move into the kind of study that underpins the book. More specifically, it's based on the narratives of 31 converts to Islam that I collected mostly in 2017. And these were kind of narrative interviews asking people to, tell me about their stories, so to speak. They were collected from different places, some small towns with few, if any, other converts, as well as from larger cities such as London, Cardiff, Bristol, with well-established Muslim communities, and in some cases even kind of reasonably established convert groups as well. The sample of people I spoke to broadly reflects what the best kind of guesstimates are in terms of what the convert population, if we can call it that, might look like in demographic terms. Just over half of the people I spoke to were white British European, a quarter British Asian, 3 black British and 2 mixed race. 19 were female and 8 male. Just under half had previously been practicing Catholic, Protestant or Hindu, while most of the rest had been nominally Protestant, Catholic, Hindu or Sikh. with just 2 describing themselves formally as spiritual and 3 as atheist. They're aged between 18 and 69 and have been Muslim between 10 months and 30 years at the time I spoke to them. And they were pretty evenly split between middle and working class, although this was based on self-identification rather than anything to do with occupation or income. So the first aspect I'd like to talk about is identity. And the main the main thing I want to highlight here is that what becomes really important is precisely the need to foreground the importance and fundamentalness of religiousness. There's a lot of nusses in that sentence, but if I can kind of put it like that, the importance of kind of religiousness for this kind of sense of self, of who they are. I mean, as I've kind of already touched on, sociologically, we are most likely to think of Muslim identity in terms of ethnicity or culture. Ethno-religious is one kind of concept that gets used, and this is kind of based on the idea of descent, being part of a community of descent. So here, the emphasis is much more on that kind of ethnic cultural side, whereas what I found with the people I was talking to was that the emphasis was much more theologically based. It was much more kind of about religiosity, much more about having a deep connection to the divine. And we see here there's an interesting dynamic in terms of establishing a deep sense of continuity, of having always been Muslim, even if this was previously unrecognised. And of course, this is precisely where the idea of revert kind of resonates. And so these aspects are kind of represented by some of the quotes here. So Hannah, for example, says that I was a Muslim all along and nobody told me. Vidya, in the one in the bottom right, talks of these names. I should have said this. These names are all anonymized. They're not their real names. So they're just names that have been assigned to them for the purposes of anonymity. But Vidya talks about how her childhood, her kind of previous life before her conversion, feels almost dreamlike. And reality now feels like proper reality. And that she says at the end of this that it feels like who I am today is who I've always been. Katarzyna here talks about the importance of the connection with the heart, and that knowledge, kind of the rational, the thinking, the cognitive, the intellectual side comes after it, but you've got to have that deep connection. And Akash also kind of talks about it in this sense. That this kind of deep, kind of heartfelt connection, as he puts it, overrides the brain's thinking. And then later when he goes on to talk about how afterwards you have to put it into the kind of the framework that works. But the first big point is the kind of the heart connecting in this spiritual form. So this really emphasizes the kind of the importance and the centrality of the religious to thinking about identity. Of course, this kind of strong sense of continuity that becomes established in this way doesn't suggest that conversion is easy or simple. Changes do happen, changes that are often difficult. Changes to diet, giving up pork and alcohol, the 5 daily prayers, fasting during Ramadan, adopting Arabic terminology to varying kind of levels and degrees, changes to traditional celebrations, to modes of socializing and so on, all occur in different ways, to different degrees, and all are difficult in different ways. And what we find, so this quote from Rosie conveys that you get this interesting kind of dynamic between this deep sense of continuity at the same time as they're kind of wrestling with aspects of change. So Rosie says here that so it was just sort of from there, it just grew, that I was thinking, yeah, this is it. This is what I want to be. This is who I am. And it wasn't that I felt I needed to change. It was sort of that I sort of realised that, yeah, this is how it is. This is what I've been looking for. And I felt like it is me, and not that I had found something that I needed to alter for. I did need to make changes, obviously, because I had been doing things that were not going to be compatible. But it just felt very natural in that way. So you get this kind of interesting dynamic here between the sense of being the same, of continuity, but at the same time quite important changes taking place. So what's kind of happening here is that you get the sense of how one both is Muslim, not just because of conversion, but one has always been Muslim. At the same time is constantly becoming Muslim through developing a kind of Islamic kind of sense of self, developing their faith as it relates to practice, and so on and so forth. And the reason why this is important is because this forces us to think about patterns of belonging and how people relate in a different way from what we normally do, certainly in kind of the academic literature and so on. And this is what I'm going to move on to talk about. And what becomes important here is a distinction between culture and religion that comes through very often in converts' narratives. And what we find is some of the things I mentioned earlier, where they're constantly thought about and constantly seen through cultural and ethnic lenses. But this kind of looking at identity in this way forces us to put religion at the forefront and begin to kind of explore it in a slightly different way. So what I want to do with this kind of distinction between culture and religion that converts often look at is, again, begin to look at it as a kind of a two-way process that has a negative and a positive kind of aspect that are interacting with each other and that are both important. That is kind of how, on the one hand, the kind of negative hand, converts can be positioned by others, while on the other kind of positive hand, they position themselves. And again, I want to kind of begin with the negative. And what we can see is kind of three processes that I'm kind of calling here: dislocation, functionalization, and refusal. And so there's a quote from Rachel here, who she says who her husband and her, who are both converts, found that they didn't fit into the categories that people like to create based on born Muslims and many times by born Muslims. And this is in an email, so she says it'd be great to speak to you more about it tomorrow before we had our interview. And this is precisely because of the frustration of being seen in kind of based on ethnicity or culture rather than kind of religion. So what these three processes, dislocation, functionalization, and refusal, represent are different ways in which they are seen from the outside and the kind of negative impact that this can have. So there's a range of responses from family and friends. Some are perfectly positive, it's like, great. Some are kind of indifferent, it's like, yeah, sure, whatever. And then there's some that are much harder than that and can lead to ostracism from their families or from their communities, even abuse, and these kind of experiences. And as a result of this, some even choose to hide their conversion, at least in the first instance, because of this fear of the response they're going to get. So Richard, whose mother was Catholic, or he was brought up a Catholic, he talked about how he hid it for 3 years before he told his mum, precisely so that she couldn't turn around to him and say, oh yeah, you can see that he's gone weird now. But of course, once he did tell her after 3 years, even though she hadn't really noticed many changes, she still did stop speaking to him. So this is the kind of thing that can happen. In wider understandings, such as those already touched upon in relation to the media, converts can kind of become dislocated from the idea of belonging to the majority, belonging to Britain, belonging to their community, or whatever it might be. And the trope of betrayal is very common here, and which echoes the kind of the historical context. So phrases such as "you're a disgrace to your country" are thrown at them, and again they can be ostracized from kind of various groups and things. So some of what happens here is that white converts in particular can become kind of re-ethnicized and seen as no longer belonging to the majority, but rather they've become kind of religiously and culturally other. For ethnic minority converts, they might kind of pass invisible as converts from a kind of majority position because they're already racialized. But they will face this kind of dislocation and estrangement or very often will face this from their immediate community and family. So if this is kind of that side of things, relations to born Muslims also present challenges. So they often talk about getting a very warm welcome. After pronouncing their shahada, they might be greeted and hugged as brother and sister, and this can be a warmth that they haven't experienced before. But they also can come to question it, because whereas the initial warmth might be very forthcoming, what many people find is that this often cools, and it leaves some of them kind of then feeling a little bit lost and almost functionalized. That is, that they can feel greeted warmly for the purity that can be accrued based on them being new and untainted by sin, rather than being seen as an individual person and a co-religionist. And so this can leave something. So Richard put this. He said that you can feel a little bit like a collector's item, and other people put this idea in different ways, like a notch on the bedpost, an arrow in the quiver, or as window dressing. And this is a particular challenge that they kind of face. Converts at times, sadly, can also experience suspicion and rejection and refusal on the base of their kind of ethnic and cultural background, not speaking Arabic or other languages such as Urdu or Punjabi, depending on kind of where they live. And it's been particularly noted in relation to black converts that they can experience outright racism. And Rosie, for example, she kind of reflected on her own personal experience of this, but also those of other converts that she's worked with. She has a role at a New Muslim organisation at her local mosque, and over the years, she's kind of heard lots of stories about this as well as her own experiences, and she kind of talked about this in terms of religious abuse. Rizwan, who was another convert I spoke to, he characterised these kind of instances as spiritual abuse or convert abuse. Because they say it's a lack of acceptance of them as kind of co-religionists, as kind of full Muslims, if you like. So if that's something of the kind of the negative side of how they are positioned, how they can be positioned by others. How do converts position themselves? And so here I'm going to kind of break down this religion-culture distinction that's often found in converts' narratives that I mentioned. But I want to do so in a way that's more relational and less binary, so not an opposition between religious and culture. But how do the ideas of religion and culture kind of come through? So as we're thinking about belonging here, I've broken this into aspects of nearness and distance. So we have religious nearness and religious distance, and cultural nearness and cultural distance. So the idea here is to try and get a slightly more complex and dynamic picture of how converts with foreground in their kind of religiousness as kind of their conception of themselves, how this kind of runs through and creates this more dynamic picture and cross-cutting relations between the ideas of culture and religion as they kind of relate and position themselves in relation to other parts of society. So to start with the idea of religious nearness, and how converts establish this sense of religious nearness. Well, this really kind of goes back to what I was saying in relation to identity, the sense of continuity, the sense of a profound connection to the divine, recognition that they are new when they are new and they've got a lot to learn, perhaps, but that they feel religiously near, religiously connected to and belonging within kind of Islam. So that's kind of quite simple because it covers a lot of things I've already said. Religious distance. This occurs, as we might expect, primarily in relation to their faith or none of upbringing. And here what we find is that on the one hand, it theologically doesn't make sense. So, for example, converts who were previously Christian talk about how the idea of the Trinity doesn't really speak to them. It doesn't make sense to them, certainly not in contrast to the idea of the oneness of God in Islam. Or Sanjay, who was brought up Hindu, talked about how the idea of blue gods with 8 arms and riding a tiger just didn't make any sense to him. And when he was asked, when he asked about it and asked questions about, well, what's going on here, he would be told that's just the way it is, and then get a clip round the ear or something like this. So in this sense, this didn't really help him at all. And again, Islam kind of did. He connected with it. The other way this comes out is the idea that these are empty. So this might be that they can feel empty. So Adele talked about in her church, and the church, kind of with a capital C, meaning the Catholic Church. She went to a Catholic university, was practicing Catholic, brought up Catholic. And she talked about personally feeling empty in the church. But also in the sense that they can see these kind of traditions, at least in where they were brought up in it, as precisely as nominal, as a matter of habit. It's what you do, but without that deeper spiritual connection, which they kind of felt within themselves. So this is where religious distance comes. Cultural nearness emerges in relation to Britain. So they establish a nearness in relation to Britain through simple ways of stating that they're still normal. Zara, who's from the East End of London, even talked about, I'm still me, I'm still Zara from the East End. And David Cameron was the Prime Minister when I was speaking to her. And she kind of challenging Cameron to come to the East End, and she'd teach him about London culture, kind of thing. So in these kind of ways, they kind of establish themselves as, culturally we're near, we still very much belong here. We haven't kind of changed our culture such that Britain isn't home anymore. This seems just patently ridiculous. But Islam also has its own sense of or what they feel as being near to in a cultural sense. And the kind of framework that is emphasized, they find emphasized in Islam around things such as alcohol being damaging for society as well as for kind of individual bodies. Also the emphasis on community, on family, and these kind of things. This kind of really speaks to them in a way that provides a very kind of good cultural kind of framework for society, and certainly for them. So in terms of cultural distance, the last one. So in relation to Britain, this predominantly kind of comes out in criticisms of Britain as being overly sexualized, particularly of the human body, the female body, in fact, and over individualized. And in this way, it contrasts with the kind of cultural nearness that they find in relation to kind of the cultural framework that they find in Islam. But cultural distance also emerges in relation to born Muslim communities, who they have contact with, wherever they might live. And this particularly comes out in stressing a distance between cultural practices that they think they find perfectly okay and perfectly normal and not a problem anyway, and certain values and practices that they are often told are Islamic and that they have to adopt in order to be a proper Muslim. So a couple of simple examples here are things like making eye contact, particularly women making eye contact with men. Rachel, for example, is one person who talks about this and about how, no, as far as I'm concerned, making eye contact, making small talk is perfectly normal. This is what we do in Britain. There's nothing wrong in it. I don't care if people tell me it's wrong. That's, it's perfectly culturally acceptable and appropriate, and this is, part of being here. And I even had people telling me about other people they knew who wouldn't speak to me precisely because it meant, being in a cafe or wherever it was, kind of with a man they didn't know, and how some people thought it was inappropriate, but how the people I spoke to will say, no, as far as we're concerned, this kind of thing is perfectly culturally appropriate. So they kind of feel this distance from a lot of the things they can be told in this sense. Another important way this emerges is in relation particularly to women and mosques. So Rachel, again, who there's no kind of women's space in the mosques near her, so she can't go to the mosque to pray. And this is something that kind of she finds very difficult. And she says that in her view, this is a man telling her that she can't pray to God and he has no right to do such a thing. So it kind of comes out in these kind of ways as well. And I want to kind of say a little bit more about this, but I want to kind of move on to talk about it in a slightly different way. And that is to think about Islamophobia. And the reason I want to kind of say a bit more about that in relation to this is because as a result of this kind of religion culture distinction that converts can make, and particularly this cultural aspect of cultural distance, some people, by which I mean some academics, have remarked that this means that converts are automatically Islamophobic as a result. They are necessarily, we can think about them safely as necessarily Islamophobic as a result of this kind of aspect of their narratives. And there's a few problems here, I think. One of them is that these studies are often based on white converts exclusively. So they very much play along the racialized lines, which of course in wider society are all too present. But this aspect of converts' narratives isn't limited, and it's not restricted to white converts. All the converts I spoke to, whatever their ethnic, religious background, all of them had similar stories to tell. And we also find similar kind of narratives of this kind of cultural religion distinction in the narratives of some particularly young born Muslims as well, this kind of idea of the generational differences. So there's clearly more going on here than this easy story of simply labelling converts as Islamophobic as a result of this. So that's what I want to kind of dig into a little bit. And again, here, this idea of placing the religious aspect of their sense of self at the foreground is really important, because it really kind of gives us a different way of understanding the types of patterns, what's happening, what's going on in this kind of relation. So I'm going to kind of expand on some of these points, and I'm going to do so in reference to these 5 tests. So Tariq Modood has tried to kind of find a way of distinguishing between what we can say is Islamophobic on the one hand against what we can say is, what we might be able to say is legitimate criticism on the other hand. So he's proposed 5 tests in order to try and do that. So what I want to do is just run through each of these tests and then kind of answer the questions that they kind of pose in relation to converts, to kind of say a bit more about this aspect of cultural distance, but also to really challenge this idea that converts are necessarily and safely Islamophobic for kind of having this aspect to their narratives. So the first test is in terms of what's being said, does it stereotype Muslims by assuming they all think the same? Now, stereotypes do appear, and I'm certainly not here to kind of make any apologies for aspects of kind of stereotype prejudice discourse that can be features of some convert narratives. But stereotypes don't appear, I want to argue, in a way that suggests that all or even most Muslims are characterized in a particular way. They're often very kind of targeted at a particular group, often one that they've kind of had difficulty with. And what happens is that this religion culture divide really distinguishes between Muslims, not against all Muslims. So it's really trying to kind of like pick out the ones where, as far as they are concerned, there's problematic aspects of culture. So you get things like, they're talking about things that are culture, but they're not Islamic, and this kind of thing. So whereas in kind of Muslims writ large or other Muslims, this doesn't happen. And of course, it doesn't. They don't suggest in any way that Muslims don't have, and Islam doesn't have worthy characteristics. Were this the case, it would be perfectly reasonable to assume that converts would be far fewer, and that they would contain themselves in kind of convert enclaves, which we don't find. And also, of course, the attraction for many in kind of prior to conversion is precisely contact with Muslims, whether it's abroad or in this country. Talking to Muslims is a huge part of what helps kind of get them to think and learn more as part of the kind of journey. So I think our answer to this has to be no. So the next test is it about Muslims or a dialogue with Muslims which they would wish to join in? And I think, again, we can see that it's certainly about wanting to engage with Muslims as fellow Muslims. It's precisely about wanting to join, wanting to be part of the faith, wanting to be part of kind of communities and helping to shape them. And what we have to understand is that some of these, particularly some of the harder kind of elements that we find in this, are responses to kind of pressures to conform, of abuse, and this kind of thing that's also runs throughout the stories. And in this sense, they're a response to kind of a loss of agency, a loss of being able to be a person and do things kind of in the communities, and part of kind of carving out a legitimate place where they can belong. So in this sense, I think what we find is really grounds for seeing Islam as a pluralistic faith, and one that offers a shared fund, or what's been called the conditions of communication for those kind of different viewpoints and positions, and that converts really seek to be conversational partners with born Muslims within Islam. I mean, Suzanne, for example, talked about a few different phases where initially it was quite difficult because she was trying to figure things out, and particularly she'd go to meetings where she'd meet other Muslim women in her local area who were all kind of from different, had different national backgrounds, or who were married to men from different parts of the world, different parts of the Muslim world. And all of them had different ideas. All of them had different kind of ideas about what you should do and how to do things and what was right and what was wrong. And it took her a while to kind of figure through this and figure out and find her own line and place where she could then contribute confidently and comfortably, and without being kind of pulled in one or more kind of cultural direction. And Matthew talked about very much wanting to trying to get involved with his local community, but finding plenty of barriers that just prevented him from being involved with the mosque committee and this kind of thing, and how this was kind of, he was saying that he was going to give it one more shot before he might have to think about kind of doing something on his own. But in the first instance, it's very much about wanting to kind of be involved with what exists. So again, I think we have to kind of I think pass this test, if we can put it like that. So next one is, do the terms of the debate allow possible mutual learning? And again, I think we have to say yes. So examples of how converts position themselves as distant from the majority culture on various grounds, and the contrast they pull up with lifestyle and the framework of social life that Islam holds out to them, as well as this sense of cultural distance, puts them in this kind of dynamic relation here, where it's very much about kind of mutual learning from all sides. Is the language civil and contextually appropriate? Now, at times the answer to this, I think, is definitely yes. At other times, it's no. At other times, it can be, the language in which these things can be expressed can be very much prejudicial and stereotyped, and often it can even be, at times, it can be scathing. But I think what's important to remember here is that the narratives that I gathered were kind of deeply felt emotional, kind of personal testimonies of experiences. They're not part of public debate or moral issues. And I think if it comes to kind of public debate and that kind of thing, the way these things are talked about would be very different. And Gail provides an example here. Gail was, I forget how old she was now, but she's been a convert for something like 18 years. And she was one of the kind of more scathing people I talked to, in terms of how she would characterize some of the things she was told and some of the cultural practices of some Muslim communities near where she lived. But on the other hand, she also talked about being proud to represent that community at certain times with the local council. She talked about being, an old white woman, so she could get away with stuff that probably born Muslims couldn't in these kind of contexts. And she was, she proudly took up that role and took it very seriously, of trying to make life better for Muslims where she lived, and kind of taking up these kind of public fora as a result. And this is what we kind of often find. There's this distinction and division is created, as I said, within, but not against Muslims in total, in which they can generally be very kind of supportive when faced with discrimination and Islamophobia from the outside. So the final one is insincere criticism for ulterior motives. And again, I think here we can confidently assert that converts do care about the issues they're criticising. As Muslims, as belonging in Islam, their positions, and of course their positions on all sorts of issues are extremely varied. They're not forms of simple attack. They're claims to belong. They're kind of strivances to contribute to a living and vibrant faith tradition and to be part of shaping that and shaping how it looks in their local area, in Britain, or so on and so forth. So that's kind of the extension of the cultural distancing in relation to Islamophobia. There's one more thing I'd just quickly like to add in terms of Islamophobia, and this really relates to an article that I've written rather than what's in the book, but it's a kind of a parallel discussion. And that is, again, this idea of when Islamophobia is talked about, particularly in academic sense, but also in policy now that it's becoming a little bit more popular than it was, a little bit more accepted, although not by the current ruling government. And that's that, again, Muslims generally and Islamophobia are conceived in terms of racism and anti-racism, which I think is fine in itself. It's achieved a lot. But it misses, again, the kind of the religious aspect, the deeply and centrally religious aspect. And this is important, partly because for a more nuanced understanding of kind of the patterns of discrimination and what's happening, as well as the kind of the way people think about their own sense of self. But also it means there's specific kind of concerns that are provoked as a result of thinking about religious discrimination around things such as free speech, hate speech, the right to criticise a religion, and these kind of things that just don't get discussed enough because religion, again, has kind of been pushed aside. So as a kind of brief summary, the main thing here is really this idea of we need to take religiousness, to put it like that, or religiosity, seriously as something positive, constructive and important. And if we don't do this, then I think we really risk misunderstanding not just what's important to people and their identities, but also patterns of social belonging, patterns of inclusion and exclusion, and also ways of addressing and understanding discrimination. And that just about wraps me up. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm very happy now to take questions.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for that talk. Yeah, that's
quite dark here, isn't it? There we go.
Great, perfect, thank you. Yes, thank you very much for that talk. It's very, very interesting and really eye-opening to hear all the different accounts from different people. You obviously spoke to so many converts from different backgrounds, and really shows. I mean, I guess we just don't see it so much in our day-to-day lives in the same way that you got to explore it. So that's really eye-opening. So thank you so much. Just in terms of the question that you raised at the beginning about the nomenclature of converts and reverts, I mean, I had only really heard about the sort of the term reverts more recently. Is that something which is true, or is that become more prevalent recently, or is that something which has been long-standing?
I'm not sure about how that's become more prevalent recently or not. I mean, I know. If I think about previous studies and studies of converts in different European countries, there's been a few done in Scandinavia, one in Germany, and this kind of thing. Some of those have argued that convert, revert, people don't want to. We shouldn't use this. We should just say things like embrace Islam. The people I spoke to varied. I mean, I would generally open with revert because that seemed, as I was going to become, that was generally more common. But some people didn't care which one it was. Some people liked convert because it did precisely kind of suggest, yes, I have made a change. I've done something deliberate. Some people preferred revert precisely because it has this idea of continuity. You're not changing from one thing to another, what you're doing is you're going back to your original state, who you originally were. And this kind of relates to Fichte and this idea of kind of the soul recognizing God in pre-eternity, and this kind of idea. One mosque, well, my original contact at a mosque, who I was talking to him on the phone, and I used revert, and he said, okay, but when you talk to the mosque leaders, make sure you use New Muslim, because if you don't, then you'll just get a lengthy lecture, just a lengthy semantic lecture. So it's very varied. I'm not sure about exactly if there's a timeline aspect to it or not.
And you chose converts for the title of the book.
Yeah, I mean, converts to the title of the book is mainly because that's the most easily understood. So revert wouldn't be a term that a lot of people, unless they know about these things and kind of really study these things, they wouldn't really know. Or if kind of Muslims probably kind of recognise that more instantly. But yes, that's why I kind of tend to use convert in the book, because it's easier to it makes more sense to more people in the first instance. But throughout the book, I use a mixture. So whenever I'm quoting people or talking about what they think, I always use what they use. And then I also discuss the difference and how they appear differently in the book. So the idea of New Muslim is something that converts accept in some ways, because they recognise that they've got a lot to learn. They're new, they're beginners, they're just trying to read the Quran, for example, or learn about history, Islamic history, and this kind of stuff. But in other ways, they can challenge it. So when they see it as being seen new, as in, oh, you're just a baby, you're new, you're not a real Muslim yet, you're not a full Muslim yet. Then they'll like, no, I reject. Then they'll kind of reject that. So I suppose you might say in a sociological sense they're okay with it, in a theological sense they reject it, if I can say something like that.
Great. So prayer time is coming up shortly, so if it's okay, we'll just take a couple of questions which come through, and then we'll end there, if that's all right. So in many places where conversion rates are potentially seen as being quite high, culture within religion is quite prevalent and sometimes even considered to be an integral part of the religion. Do you think that this pushes more people away from conversion, or do you think it actually draws people towards it?
I think that can be difficult. I think that there's different things going on, in the sense that, as I said, often the attraction can precisely be through having met Muslims and spoken to them and talked to them, and particular aspects of the way they behave and act and kind of make sense and speak to them, and so that can be part of the attraction. But later on, it can cause significant difficulties, mainly because of pressures to conform. A lot of people can face pressures to conform. You've got to do this, you've got to behave like that. Particularly for women who often face, who get married and can face pressure from the family to perform a particular gender role and do particular things that they're not necessarily comfortable with. So this can kind of create real problems. And this is where you begin to get this kind of sense of, okay, I need to figure this out for myself. I need to step back here and figure things out. And kind of people talk about kind of wanting to retreat from the community shortly after and have it to themselves. Like, I've got to figure this stuff out and then go back out. So that story about Suzanne is kind of one of these examples. And then go back out, because then they're more confident. So they can feel like they can challenge. They can say, oh, no, this because of this and that because of that. Hannah even talked about, she's talked about things like, oh yeah, just me, through my sheer stupidity, I've kind of made people think about things more, because people tell her to do things. That's how you should do it. It's in the Quran. And she says, is it? Because I can't find it anywhere. Show me where it is. And then if the person can't, then she says, oh, well, that's okay then. I can do this. And things like that. So creating this kind of interaction. So that's the kind of, so yeah, it can be a really difficult thing. In terms of whether it makes people leave, I think for some they will leave as a result, and some do leave as a result. The other reason why people leave is nothing to do with Muslims, their families. The pressure from their families can be enormous, and some people just can't take it, and so they leave as a result of that as well. So this is the problem. It's kind of getting these pushes from different directions, and you're stuck. There's this really important kind of thing happening in your life, and both sides, your support can be missing, and that's really difficult.
Great, thank you. And so you mentioned that some women didn't take part in your interviews because of concerns of not being allowed to being seen interacting with you in the cafe that you mentioned. Was this a large number, and do you think that this may have skewed the view that you have of the converts because there's a limited, I guess, cohort which took part in the interviews? I think I saw in the previous slide actually that you said that actually you had more women than men. You had 19 females to 8 males or something like that.
Yeah, well, the kind of best guesstimates reckon that there's about 2/3 to 3/4 of the converts are female, and that's kind of reflected. So plenty of women did speak to me. And of course, there were ones that didn't. Whether that would change things or not is impossible for me to say because they didn't speak to me. My suspicion would be that some of the similar. It's the dynamics I'm interested in, the processes rather than because the actual practices, the actual interpretations, and these kind of things vary hugely. What people will do, won't do, what people think is right and wrong. This really, really varies. And that's not so much what I'm interested in, but what I'm interested in is the kind of the processes and the dynamics. So this religion culture thing and how that works and what's going on. And I think that would kind of play out in that kind of terms of dynamics similarly with those people. How many there were, again, I don't know because they didn't speak to me. I just know this anecdotally through a couple of people saying, oh yeah, and there's a couple of other people in that group who, we were talking about it and they were a bit worried about speaking to you. They weren't sure if they should or not. And, they've kind of opted kind of not to. In terms of, what percentage that might be if I was to try and canvass the whole female convert population, what percentage would or wouldn't, I can't say that. It wasn't that kind of study, unfortunately. I'm not really able to answer that question fully, I suppose, in that way.
Perfect, thank you. Just one last question. Is cultural integration and assimilation, I guess, of the Muslim population in Britain, as an example, an important factor in the way in which converts to a faith, such as those who are converted to Islam, are seen? And I guess more relevant to that, perhaps, is now the significant idea of Islamophobia. And it sounds as if the number of converts, for example, hasn't changed. If anything, it's gone up. Is that right? And how does that sort of play as a role in terms of conversion and cultural assimilation, I guess? So, sorry, can I just want to kind of get a handle on exactly the idea of integration and assimilation for? So I think that the question is more about the way. So I guess the way that Muslims are seen might be altered by the way that Muslims generally assimilate or integrate within British values, I guess, and that then impacts the way that Muslims are seen, and therefore does that affect the idea of conversion, I guess, is the question. So are converts seen in similar ways to how Muslims are seen in terms of? So I guess post converting, yeah. Yeah, converts. They face many similar in terms of Islamophobia. A lot of the stuff they face is similar to what born Muslims face. But there are also some differences here, because some people have said that as a result of the kind of discrimination that converts face, this is akin to them kind of facing the immigrant. They go through the immigrant experience. This is what some people have said, and I think there's something to that. But one of the interesting things about converts, of course, is that it's the differences. And so when they become dislocated, or people dislocate them, see them as not belonging anymore, it's from the place, the town, the family, the community, the streets, the colleagues, the people that they've known, that they've grown up, that they've been around with for years, who all of a sudden begin to see them completely differently. So this can kind of have a slightly different effect to how they experience that and how they're seen, because it's not a change of place and then they're being seen differently from how they're used to. They're in the same place, they're doing the same things, but are seen as completely different people by others as a result. And that's one of the things that makes it so difficult.
getting on a bus that you've got on for years, and then all of a sudden everyone's looking at you weirdly and not coming, and they don't come and sit next to you anymore. And you're like, what's going on? I've just got a headscarf on, and all of a sudden nobody will sit next to me. But it's because of the sameness in a way. It's because there's that change in reaction to them, but there's other things that they're doing are happening in the same place, and that's what causes a lot of the kind of the issues.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much, Thomas, for joining us this evening. Prayer times are upon us and past, in fact. So we'll now break for prayers, if that's okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for joining. Just a couple of announcements for those who are joining us for the next couple of programs. So we've got our Eid programs on Wednesday, the 28th of July. We have Sheikh Yusuf Al-Salhi, who'll be joining us, and the program begins at 8 o'clock and will include a Qasida by Yusuf Nur Muhammad. And then we have Eid al-Bahila on 30th of July, so next Friday, and that will be with a talk by Dr. Amina Inlows. And for those of you who'd like to join us tomorrow evening, we have a discussion about the way in which we're planning to open and have our programs live in person over the coming weeks. If you'd like to find out more about that or participate, please do email us on info@sikkim.org.uk or visit our website for more information about our other programs, www.sikkim.org.uk. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and we hope you'll join us in the future programs as well. Assalamu alaikum.